You know, Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that. But it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolon Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolon is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
Life can be seen as such a gift when you're staring death in the eyes.
He's probably 6 inches from my face, and then he aimed at my head, emptied out the 3 or 4 more bullets.
Unbelievable tales from everyday people that narrowly escaped their demise.
He said, here's what we're going to do. You're going to pick A or B, and if you pick the right one, you'll live, and if you pick the wrong one, you'll die.
Stories from real-life survivors.
And these sharks are around here. And they circle around the boat that whole day. What's going to happen? Are we going to be alive the next day, or are we going to be fish food?
A podcast on how terrifying life can get.
He repeatedly told me that if I told anybody that, he would kill me and my family members.
Listen to the I Survived podcast to hear how tragedy turns into triumph.
There's a point where your mind kind of takes over and you find out you're a lot stronger than you are.
I Survived is available now, wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Brett,
And I'm Alice.
and we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors. In March of 1918, the USS Cyclops and its 309 crew members vanished without a trace. That was enough to make it a story, but where it disappeared would make it a legend. The Bermuda Triangle. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my Cyclopean co-host, Alice.
Hello, Brett. How mythological of you. And I do love that. You know, I love me a good pun. We're going to talk about Cyclops. I'm not going to lie. When you told me we were going to talk about the Bermuda Triangle and the USS Cyclops, I didn't hear the USS part. And I was like, we're talking about Cyclops in the Bermuda Triangle? How weird can it get? And the answer is still, it's pretty weird. Okay, I have to ask you, Brett. I have to ask you. So we, you know, we're pretty contemporaneous, you know, in the 80s and 90s. We grew up in the 80s and 90s, like when we were coming of age. I remember, like, every other day, there was a news story or there was some, like, Goosebumps book or some Nickelodeon Are You Afraid of the Dark about the Bermuda Triangle. And as a kid, I remember thinking, this is really scary. When I grow up, I'm going to have to deal with things like the Bermuda Triangle, and that's going to be really scary because what if I have to fly an airplane over it or, you know, captain a ship through the Bermuda Triangle and I just have to, like, face my death and do it? And you know what happened when I grew up? I have never had to deal with the Bermuda Triangle in my real life. So was that an 80s and 90s like childhood thing? Are the kids today as scared of the Bermuda Triangle as we were? And why? Why were we so scared of the Bermuda Triangle?
There were two things that I thought would occupy a lot more of my time and concern as an adult. The Bermuda Triangle and quicksand. And I got to say, neither one of those ever really manifested itself in any way to this point. Now, you never know. It could happen in the future. You know, we start making enough money on this podcast and I get my mega yacht and I may be sailing through the Bermuda Triangle and who knows what might happen. And we get shipwrecked on an island and there's quicksand. And then what will we do? But yeah, those were two things that I think for me, quicksand, I don't know if you ever saw The Never Ending Story. Did you ever see The Never Ending Story?
Yeah.
You talk about I can't believe we let children watch that. It scars you for life.
It was like It and Clowns and Never Ending Story. Yeah. I totally agree with you. Like, I remember if I was walking across like a marshy kind of terrain, like on the way to school, my immediate thought was like, oh my gosh, have I stepped in quicksand? It's all over. The second your foot touches quicksand, like to the ends of the earth, you're pulled.
Right. And for all I know, that's true. I assume quicksand is a real thing. Right.
It is a real thing, but I don't think you like touch it and then get sucked into an orb.
Yeah. Unless, of course, you're in the Bermuda Triangle. And then you never know what might happen to you. And we are telling, I mean, this is a great story, no matter what.
It's a really good story.
You know why it's a good story?
Historical mysteries.
Number one, it's historical. And number two, it's about a ghost ship. And if only there was some music that went along with sailing. If there was, maybe Jason Usry could put it in post and it would be playing even as we talk right now.
Is there like an entire genre of shanties perhaps that could go well here?
Perhaps shanties of the sea? Maybe?
Shanties that's interesting, of the sea in particular. You see, that's so interesting because perhaps they can make me sound like I'm just a mermaid underwater as opposed to being sick yet again.
Yes, there you go. That's it. Alice is really trying to appear to be a mermaid. She's not sick. She would never record sick. That's crazy.
Who does that?
Who goes
to work sick?
Who does that? Well, in any event, so we're talking about the USS Cyclops. It's a really interesting story from a really interesting period of time, even without the Bermuda Triangle. But we're going to talk about the Bermuda Triangle too, because it's awesome as well. And, you know, we spent 8-9 episodes on a really depressing topic, as we like to do. We like to talk about some fun topics, like 300 people disappearing on a ship. You know, lots of fun there.
That's a lot of people,
USS Cyclops.
by the way.
That's a lot of people.
That's a small town. There are towns in Alabama smaller than that.
As we're going to talk about this ship, this is not some tiny little ship. This is one of the biggest ships in the Navy at the time. It's the equivalent of like an aircraft carrier disappearing today. It's a big deal, and it was a big deal at the time. So let's give you a little bit of the history for those of you who don't know anything about this ship. The USS Cyclops was a fuel ship, and I feel like, by the way, just as an aside, back in the day, they did a much better job naming ships, I feel like. Ship names now are kind of boring.
I mean, look, if I saw it, you know, I'm like a Russian operative and I see USS Cyclops, I'm like, don't want to deal with that one. You know, I want to go for like, you know, purring of a cat, not the Cyclops, because you anger that god. You don't know what's coming.
Like there's the expedition to find the Northwest Passage. It was a British expedition, and the lead ship was called the Terror. I mean, that's a great name for a ship, the Terror. And then like, you know, obviously you had Titanic, which sounds awesome, and Olympic.
Call it the Virus, you know, am I right?
Yeah,
like, I don't want the Virus.
Now it's like they're named after like cute fish and stuff. I don't know. And presidents. So, whatever. Anyways, USS Cyclops. It was built back in 1910 in Philadelphia by the William Cramp and Sons Company. And the ship was massive, as we've been saying. It measured 542 feet long and 65 feet wide. She was classified as a Proteus, another great name for a ship, class collier, which means it's a ship that carries coal. You got to remember, back at this time, most ships were still powered by coal-fired engines. So, you know, you run out of coal in the middle of the ocean, that's going to be a problem. So they basically had these refueling ships that warships could hook up with and be refueled, and that's what the Cyclops did. It actually had the ability to carry 2,500 tons of coal while making 15 knots. At slower speeds, if you're willing to cut some of the speed, it could actually carry up to as much as 12,500 tons of coal, which is a lot of coal. And it carried that coal around the world. It traveled between the Baltic Sea, the Caribbean, Mexico, South America, transporting coal and helping refugees during a period of global unrest. Shortly after it was built in 1914, as most of you know, World War I kicked off. The United States was not involved for a pretty significant period of time, 3 years or so. But during that period, you had a lot of people who were being displaced because of the war, a lot of refugees, and a lot of goods that needed transporting, and the Cyclops was perfect for that. But it wasn't long before the United States did enter World War I in 1917. And at that point, it was commissioned into the American Expeditionary Force, which is the name of the force that went over to Europe for the war, and arrived in France on May 1st, 1917. And from that point, she continued this coal and cargo carrying mission, bringing cargo back and forth to the troops on the Western Front. And at the time, as we said earlier, the Cyclops was one of the largest ships in the Navy, with a complement of over 300 crew members. By January of 1918, the Cyclops was back in American waters and was actually set to embark on a mission to transport around 10,000 tons of coal from her home port, which was Norfolk, Virginia, to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And the purpose of this, there was actually a large flotilla of British ships in South America at the time, and the Cyclops was going to refuel those ships, which were obviously an ally with the United States during World War I. Once it did that, it was going to bring back 11,000 tons of manganese ore. Manganese ore is used in the production of steel, which obviously was very important to the war effort at the time. That was its mission, and this was pretty routine. It's sailing through waters that could occasionally have a U-boat or two, but pretty safe. That's what it was going to do. No one expected it to have any trouble. But with this fateful trip, the Cyclops would sail into history.
So poetic, Brett. Well, even though this is a historical mystery, especially because it's a historical mystery, we certainly have a timeline. So let's dive straight into that timeline. On January 9th, 1918, the USS Cyclops, commanded by Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley and a crew of 306 members, departed her home port in Norfolk, Virginia, and began their journey to Brazil to refuel some British ships off the coast. And remember, they can still move at a pretty good clip. So 19 days later, on January 28th, 1918, the Cyclops arrived in Rio de Janeiro with 9,960 tons of coal. So nearly 10,000 tons of coal. A lot of coal to fuel these warships. Now, the ship and crew remained in Rio de Janeiro for a little more than 2 weeks, unloading coal, loading the ship back up with the 10,000 to 11,000 tons of manganese ore, which, as Brett already mentioned, is used in steel making. So these 2 weeks, there's just a lot of work happening, moving things off the ship, moving things onto the ship. Now, while in Rio, Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley reported, quote, a cracked cylinder in the starboard engine. Now, this damage was reviewed, and Worley was issued the recommendation to return to the U.S. to be repaired. So, perhaps a little foreboding of what is to come.
And I think the ship was still ship shape. It could still travel. This is going to be mostly a problem of speed. Because of this, the ship's not going to be able to go as fast as it would like to go. And as we all know, time is money. Those of you who are fans of the Titanic, which we should do the Titanic sometime. Alice,
So,
are you familiar with some of the conspiracy theories?
I'm into a lot of conspiracy theories with the Titanic. My kid recently learned about he calls it the Titanic, and I cannot change him no matter what. He calls it the Titanic because he learned about it from some kid at school who had a book about it. So now we have multiple encyclopedic books about Titanic. And I would love to do the Titanic because there are a lot of interesting conspiracy theories. And I definitely do not want to go on a pod to go see it, though, in person.
No.
Because we know how it ends.
That ship has sailed, as they say.
That ship has
I still want to go to
done other
Dyatlov
things.
Pass, but I don't know that I want to
do that
go
either. You should know better, Brett.
to the bottom of the sea. Maybe. Depends on where the winds blow me. But anyways, the Titanic, just briefly, this is not in the notes, but while we're here, because, I feel like whenever we talk about these ghost ships, we always kind of go off on tangents. I feel like the Mary Celeste was our most hilarious episode from the perspective of we laughed through the whole thing. Talking about this
It was a good
tragedy,
one.
this family disappears.
And we didn't even hear the sea shanties at the time. Now, at least I know what they sound like.
Yeah, it's true.
I really hope we put in the sea shanty about the possum.
So the Titanic, a couple things. Number one, there's a conspiracy theory that there was a cursed mummy in the cargo hold, and that's why it sank. Which I always like that one. There's a big conspiracy theory that it wasn't actually the Titanic. It was the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, not the Titanic. The reasons for this are a little unclear. It's some sort of insurance fraud. I'm not entirely sure exactly why they decided to do this, but there's this whole thing about, was it really the Titanic or was it the Olympic that sank and the Titanic continued to sail? Like I said, I don't really know why it matters. I mean, you're sinking a ship either way, but nevertheless, insurance fraud, sexy stuff, right? So we can talk about that. It's a great, it's just the story. And there's also the sort of negligence aspect of the whole thing. And the fact that the captain and the White Star Line, they were so eager to reach New York in record time. So they were traveling much too quickly through an ice field. Just that whole thing. There's sort of interesting legal questions. Nothing really to do with
and the fact
our
that
current
there are
story.
Survivors, right, who could report. Like the story we're talking about today, Mary Celeste, we have no survivors who can tell us anything. And the thing with the Titanic, and obviously a lot of, the trauma around surviving can color what you remember. But there are a lot of survivors, which I think is very interesting as well.
There's some great lost ship stories. We'll do some more. We'll do some more lost ship stories. But for now, let us return to the USS Cyclops. So it has this cracked cylinder, so it's going to be traveling a little bit slower, but it's still going to head back to its next scheduled stop, which is Baltimore, Maryland. That's where it's going to drop off this manganese ore at the steel mills there, and also to carry on trains deeper into the country to produce steel. It starts heading that way. It's got its 309 crew members on board, leaves Rio de Janeiro, and heads towards Bahia, Brazil. I don't know. Sorry if you're in Brazil. I mispronounced that. My fault. Anyways, it stops there briefly, stays there for a couple days. It takes 5 days for it to get from Rio to Bahia, February 20th, 1918. 2 days later, loaded with supplies, ready to take off, heads north towards Baltimore. Now, this journey is about 4,800 nautical miles, and the ship is expected to arrive in Baltimore on March 13th, 1918. So a little less than a month later. This is a good moment to stop and just give props to the Merchant Marine, because the Merchant Marine often gets forgotten. And I feel like I always go on tangents when we talk about ghost ships too. The Merchant Marine gets forgotten when we talk about the war effort, right? But did you know, Alice, that in World War II, the service with the highest percentage of casualties was the Merchant Marine?
Huh, why is that?
Yeah. Because, so the Merchant Marine, they're the ones who sail all the cargo ships. So in both World War I and World War II, the Germans targeted cargo in an attempt to cut off the British from their resupply, so that British would essentially be starved into surrendering. And the Merchant Marine, they sail on these ships, and it's just a really dangerous job. Naval ships were sunk in both wars, obviously, but the tonnage that went down in the Merchant Marine, really high. So it's the Merchant Marines are at the top.
Makes sense.
Followed by the Marines.
You go for the supply lines, cut them off at the throat.
Exactly. And so these 300 guys who were sailing the ship are probably Merchant Marine guys, because they're the ones who are sort of trained in transporting cargo, loading cargo, doing all that sort of stuff. So I would expect that this was probably the Merchant Marine. So it leaves, headed towards Baltimore. On March 3rd, it makes an unplanned stop in Barbados to resupply. And this is one of those facts. The problem with this case, it's a beautiful case. Great, legend, mystery. Everybody always wants to talk about the Bermuda Triangle. You don't get a lot of details about other things that happen. But this is an unscheduled stop. And I think that tells you something about the ship. It makes you wonder exactly what's going on the ship. Why is it making this unplanned stop? Why does it need to resupply? Is there something going on with the ship that maybe we don't know about that forced them to make this unscheduled stop, which is going to slow them down and make them take longer to get home? They've got about 1,800 nautical miles left. So they've gone 3,000 miles. I mean, that's a long way. They're in Barbados. They actually end up adding more cargo to the ship. Now, the ship was already considered heavy at this point. It had about 11,000 tons of manganese ore on board. So it's adding even more cargo, which is adding to its weight. And that is one of those things that when we talk about the disappearance might be related. But at this point, it gets ready to leave and sails into history.
So the next day, they're only there for a day, despite, stopping to resupply because they got to make their time. On March 4th, 1918, the USS Cyclops departed to embark on the final leg of their journey. And because of the heavy cargo load and the damage to one engine that we know of, the speed of the ship was greatly reduced to only about 10 knots or 11.5 miles per hour. After this point, no one would ever hear from the USS Cyclops or any of its crew members again. The ship and the 309 men on board had vanished. There was no distress call. There was no storm. There was nothing. All we know is that they simply disappeared. In fact, the last transmission received from the ship simply said, quote, "Weather fair, all well."
Which reminds you, it's creepy. That reminds me of the lighthouse from all the way
That's
back
right.
at the beginning of the podcast. And a very similar last transmission, though this one's real. We're not sure that one ever actually happened in the lighthouse one. But in this case, the last word we get from this ship is everything's fine. In fact, there's no reason for concern at all.
And this is really interesting because, again, they're not fighting some sort of elements. We'll talk about kind of the weather patterns here and the waves. None of that is really at issue, which I think begins to focus your mind on what may be at issue. On March 13th, 1918, the USS Cyclops was expected to arrive in Baltimore, Maryland, but as we now know, it never made it. Despite intense searches where Navy ships, quote, scouted the route that the Cyclops was believed to have taken and crews radioed day after day for any sign of contact, no sign of the vessel was ever discovered. And this is huge. Not only is this one of the, largest ships, it was a very useful ship that was in circulation all year. It had more than 300 Navy members, maybe merchant Marines, valuable people during this war effort. And it had 11,000 tons of manganese ore, which they needed for their steel making. So this was very valuable for lots of reasons. And the Navy certainly put in a bunch of resources to look for them, but they came up empty-handed.
And it's worth noting, they didn't find anything. And this is unusual. It is unusual to not find anything. I mean, obviously, a lot of the ship is made of steel. Steel sinks. You're not going to find, part of the ship floating on the water. But there's a lot of stuff in the ship that does float. There's life jackets, lifeboats. There's, wooden stuff that's on the ship. Beds, chairs, that kind of thing. There's all sorts of stuff that does float. And ordinarily, even when you have a ship disappear, and even when you have very little knowledge of what happened, you'll find something. If you don't find anything, you'll at least find an oil slick, because in a ship like this, there's going to be a ton of oil all throughout the ship, and that floats on water. So a lot of times, even if you don't find anything else, you'll find an oil slick, a pretty big one. And it tells you, don't know what happened, but we know the ship went down, and we know because we see the oil slick. Or years later, something washes up on an island. Remember, we're going to talk about the Bermuda Triangle here in a minute. And one of the things that's interesting about the Bermuda Triangle, it's not like out in the middle of the Pacific at Point Nemo where nobody ever goes. There's all sorts of islands around the Bermuda Triangle that are inhabited. Stuff washes up on those islands all the time. You would expect if there's anything to wash up, it would wash up. But amazingly, this ship manages to just sink with no distress call, no debris found, no oil slick. It's as if the ocean just sort of opened up and swallowed it whole, and you never saw anything.
Which is precisely my deep fear of the Bermuda Triangle as a child. So everything about this story, I think, is the very fuel kindling of that deep-seated fear of the Bermuda Triangle, where the earth can appear to open up and swallow you whole. And that's just the crazy thing. Even with things like this, you're right. There's almost always some indication. If you guys remember that submarine that went down to go look at the Titanic, unfortunately, it blew up into smithereens. And we know that because we were able to find smithereens, scattered about. And that was a much, 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 much smaller vessel in a much bigger range of where to look. And we were still able to find evidence of debris indicating that something catastrophic had happened in that submarine. So they searched for about a month, and on April 14th, 1918, the Navy notified the next of kin for all men on board that the USS Cyclops could not be accounted for. They also issued a public statement regarding the disappearance.
So at this point, this is a huge loss. In fact, it is the largest non-combat loss of life in Navy history, is this ship when it disappeared. So this is a big deal. I mean, they spent a lot of effort trying to find it. They didn't find it, and unfortunately, they had to declare that all these men had died. So what happened to it? And that's pretty much the end of our story as far as anything concrete goes. As we said, they've never found any trace of it. You sort of wonder, Alice, I don't know if you saw the Amelia Earhart disappearance is always a favorite, and they're trying to find her, and they were using sonar on the bottom of the ocean, and they found sort of a shadow that kind of looks like a plane. In fact, kind of looks like her plane. And there was this question about, have they found it? Have they found her plane at the bottom of the ocean? And, you know, that's one of those things you wonder about in a case like this. This is a big ship. If this ship is down there, if it wasn't abducted by aliens, then you would think they would find it at some point if they search hard enough. But up to this point, they have not found any trace of it whatsoever. Which brings us to why you're all here. Let's talk about the Bermuda Triangle, because the Cyclops disappeared in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle. Alice, did you ever watch Quantum Leap?
I don't think I watched that one.
So Quantum Leap was a great show that they remade it recently. I haven't watched any of the remake, but back in the day, Scott Bakula starred in Quantum Leap, and it was all about a guy who invents time travel, essentially, and he goes back in time and he inhabits sort of the body of people who something happened to them. Dr. Sam Beckett stepped into the Quantum Leap accelerator and disappeared. Anyways, and so he's got this guy who can kind of help him try and figure out exactly what it was that went wrong in the past that he's trying to fix. Well, there was like a Halloween episode which took place in the Bermuda Triangle. And during that episode, spoiler alert, 30 years ago, spoiler alert. So in that episode, he's actually flying on a plane with a friend, and they're flying in the Bermuda Triangle, and all sorts of weird stuff starts to happen. And basically, sort of the point of this is the friend is dealing with a tragedy that happened to him in World War II when his ship was torpedoed, and he was the only person who survived, and it was torpedoed in the Bermuda Triangle. Anyways, everything happens. They manage to not die in the Bermuda Triangle, and the guy is finally telling his wife and telling his friend what happened to him, because it's a secret he kept all this time. And he talks about how the ship was torpedoed, and he was picked up by another Navy ship, the USS Cyclops. And later on, it was torpedoed too, and then he was picked up, a plane saw him, and he was rescued. And the end of the show is Ziggy, who's like the computer, and Al, who is the guy who Ziggy tells Al the stuff, and he relays it to Dr. Sam Beckett, telling him that the USS Cyclops disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle in 1918. And so it's just all tying this all together, and that's like the big wow twist at the end. Anyway, so I've thought about the USS Cyclops since then because of that television show. You guys should all go watch it if you haven't seen it. It's one of the best ever.
That's a deep cut, Brett.
Deep cut. So there's going to be lots of opportunities to play sea shanties in this episode. So let's talk about the Bermuda Triangle.
Let's. This is what I want to talk about.
Let's. So the Bermuda Triangle, for those of you who don't know, is a triangle. I know this is a surprise to everyone. Roughly triangular shape. It's a section of the North Atlantic Ocean off of North America, off of the United States, in which more than 50 ships and 20 airplanes are said to have mysteriously disappeared without a trace. Now, not everybody agrees on the exact boundaries here, but I think generally people will tell you. You've got the Atlantic coast of Florida up to Bermuda, and the island's known as the Greater Antilles. So basically, you're up to Bermuda, you're down over to the Antilles, back over to Florida, and everything that's contained in that area is the Bermuda Triangle. And there are a lot. You've all probably actually been through the Bermuda Triangle at some point in your life. If you've gone anywhere, if you've gone to Bermuda, if you've gone really anywhere east of Florida, you've probably traveled through it and you didn't die. But lots of people do, and it's been one of those things that has turned into a legend. because of all these strange happenings and unexplained disappearances. It's also an area where people see a lot of UFOs. There's a lot of that kind of activity in the area, so that it just adds to the lore. Think of it as sort of the Point Pleasant, Virginia of the ocean. A lot of strange things going on there. And as we said, there have been ships that have been found completely abandoned with no obvious motive. There have been planes and ships that have disappeared. There have been ships and planes that have transmitted distress signals that really didn't make any sense, and they were never heard from again. And there's even a lighthouse story in the Bermuda Triangle. 2 lighthouse keepers who vanished without a trace. Now, it was probably the hurricane that hit the lighthouse, but nevertheless, we're going to leave that out because it makes it sexier to ignore the hurricane. So there's a lot of things that have happened in this area. Now, look, I know what some of you are saying. Is it really that strange? Is it really that weird? Or is it just us creating this to make the world a more interesting place? And people will point to things. They will say, look, if you take any area, triangular area of the ocean, you plop down a triangle on the ocean, you're going to find a lot of ships that have disappeared, a lot of planes that have disappeared without any trace. It just happens. The ocean is vast. It's really hard to find things that go missing in the ocean, even with our technology today. You think about, I forget the call sign, the Malaysia Airlines flight. I mean, that's an airplane in the modern world that managed to essentially disappear. Not just essentially, it did disappear. And people argue to this day about where exactly it went, what happened to it. We've had some evidence that seems to point towards one particular direction. Maybe we'll do that story eventually. But these things happen. Places disappear. The one thing I'll say about the Bermuda Triangle that's interesting, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, it is not in the middle of nowhere. It is not the kind of place that should be that hard to reach safety if you had some sort of trouble, mechanical or otherwise. It is right there off the coast of Florida. It's not in the middle of the Pacific. There's a place called Point Nemo in the middle of the Pacific, which is the farthest point from any human being that you can be in the world. And the southern Pacific Ocean is vast. And if somebody disappeared there, have any trouble there, no help's coming. The Bermuda Triangle, we should have help. And there's going to be other stories that eventually we're going to do about the Bermuda Triangle, which just highlight this, where people are in constant radio contact with people who are trying to help them. And yet they just seem to disappear.
And unlike kind of other parts of the ocean, it's not only well-traveled, and it's not only close to, say, the coast of Florida, which obviously is well-traveled as well, but there are lots of islands, as you noted, with a lot of people who can be quickly there in times of distress, who can see things, who can witness debris and wreckage wash up. And the strangest thing about all this is, with all of the witnesses, with all of the resources in this area, this is seemingly an area where things disappear into the middle of nowhere.
And there's a couple possibilities here about why this happened. I mean, maybe it's just magic water and it sucks down planes. But when you're trying to think through sort of what might be some explanations, one is that we're just making it up. That basically this is just our brains trying to make order out of chaos. Whatever. Believe that if you want to. The other is that there's some sort of magnetic anomaly, some sort of environmental or geophysical force there that makes navigation difficult. A couple places that we know are like this. Dyatlov Pass is one of these places. I think we talked about this when we did Dyatlov Pass, but Dyatlov Pass is a place where compasses don't work very well because the mineral deposits in the area were highly magnetized. And so attempting to use a magnet to navigate was actually pretty difficult in Dyatlov Pass. There's another place called the South Atlantic Anomaly, which I don't know if a lot of people know about the South Atlantic Anomaly, but essentially in the southern part of the Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of South America, going really all the way to South Africa, there is just this strange place where, because of electromagnetic disturbances, it actually makes us do a lot of things differently. We don't fly planes through that area. We send satellites on different courses so they don't pass through it. When they do pass through it, it's a problem. We don't send spacecraft through it. It's just a weird sort of little area where the radiation levels are higher, communication is more difficult, like all sorts of weird stuff is happening. These things just exist on Earth for various reasons. They're not supernatural. They're just natural anomalies. And there is one that just so happens to go through the Bermuda Triangle. and that's the agonic line. So the agonic line is an area on the Earth where the true north, so the North Pole, the direction of the North Pole, and magnetic north are the same. This is not true most places. Most places, the magnetic North Pole is not actually where the North Pole is. And when you're navigating, you have to take account of that. And you have to adjust your navigations because of it. And the North Pole actually moves. It wobbles around. Well, in the Bermuda Triangle, the North Pole and the magnetic North Pole are the same. So if you're attempting to navigate and you don't realize that, or you don't take into account, it actually can have significant effects on your ability to navigate in the Bermuda Triangle.
That was
you
a
have
lot
any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love how you're like, it's not supernatural. It's just natural occurrences of supernatural like things, because to me that sounds really supernatural and super crazy. And yes, I've definitely heard that where, you know, the Bermuda Triangle messes with your compasses, or, you know, you have those, I'm remembering 90s TV shows where a ship goes through the Bermuda Triangle and a dense fog settles in, all of a sudden their compasses start going haywire and explode, and then who knows what happens next. But I appreciate your attempt at using science and evidence to explain for these supernatural things. So let's talk about some more other theories that could explain what is happening in the Bermuda Triangle, if anything at all. So the rogue waves is another popular theory about what's causing kind of these disappearances within the Bermuda Triangle. These are massive waves that can reach heights of up to 100 feet, making them capable of destroying not just ships, but also aircraft. I can't imagine anything scarier than if I'm flying a plane and I see from below 100-foot wave coming at me and nothing I can do about it before it washes me over. So that's just, you know, like a deep nightmare. But the Bermuda Triangle is susceptible to these waves because even though we said it's a well-traveled area, it's close to Florida, it is in a location in the Atlantic Ocean where storms can come from all sides. So it's essentially being pummeled at all angles, not just from one direction because of its location. Now, the other theory is that there's really no increased incidence of disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle at all. And it's just a highly traveled area. So because of the sheer number of ships and planes going through it, statistically, the number of disappearances will also increase, not proportionally, just statistically, as a pure volume sense. In fact, the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has said, quote, there's no evidence that mysterious disappearances occur with any greater frequency in the Bermuda Triangle than in any other large, well-traveled area of the ocean.
Which they would say.
And all I have to say, really quick, also sounds like a government cover-up if I ever heard one.
Exactly. They want you to believe that. Those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s know, though.
We know better about quicksand and
That's right.
the Bermuda Triangle.
Mm-hmm.
So on those two kind of theories, the rogue wave theory, though, it doesn't account for the lack of wreckage and the lack of things washing up within all of the various islands, populated islands in this area. Now, it's possible that these waves could create some sort of cyclone effect where all of the wreckage is in one area in the ocean. But again, because it is so well-traveled, it would be very unlikely, and a lot of ships and planes that do travel through the area without ever disappearing and meeting any sort of strange effects have never spotted any sort of cyclonic area in the middle of the ocean where all of the debris has gathered. And so the wave theory, while interesting to me, what's so strange about these Bermuda disappearances is that they disappear into thin air, and the waves would not account for that.
I'll say this thing about rogue waves when we're talking about rogue waves. Rogue waves were one of those things that were theorized for a long time and often posited as a reason for ships that just disappear without a trace. For a long time, scientists didn't really believe that they were possible. But we've put these buoys out. Nobody really ever sees them because if you get hit by a rogue wave, you probably sink. But we put these buoys out in the middle of the ocean now that they use to record wave height. And they have now recorded these rogue waves where literally there will be, for reasons that are not entirely clear, could be seismic activity. It's not storms, because usually these things happen in pretty clear areas. There will just be a 60-foot wave, a 100-foot wave that comes through. And the only reason we know is because this buoy all of a sudden is lifted 100 feet in the air and records that wave, and then the wave just goes on, and that's it. There's not like, it's literally one wave, this massive wave that just rolls through all of a sudden. So now we know they exist. They do exist. They probably don't account for what happens in the Bermuda Triangle for all the reasons Alice said. Obviously, you have planes that are disappearing as well, which are probably flying too high to be hit by a wave, but you never know. I mean, some of these planes fly pretty low, but probably not that. Another theory, which we don't have in our list, but we'll just go ahead and discuss because that's what we're doing, is discussing random theories here, is Atlantis. You familiar with Atlantis, Alice?
Atlantis.
The theory of Atlantis,
yes.
the story of Atlantis. One of the greatest
100%.
stories ever told, right? Yeah, Atlantis, one of the great powers, the most advanced civilization of antiquity, which disappeared in one day and night, washed below the waves. Well, there was a purported psychic named Edgar Cayce who claimed to have had a vision that Atlantis was actually beneath the waves near Bimini. Bimini, which is on the border of the Bermuda Triangle. And the evidence that's often used to support this is the Bimini Road, which is basically a long line of beach rock. Beach rock forms on the beaches due to various natural forces. It's the kind of thing you might build with if you lived in that area and you don't have access to a lot of their stone. But anyways, there's this long line of beach rock, which looks like a road. That's why it's called the Bimini Road. And that's sort of used as evidence that this is a causeway leading to Atlantis. So some people have speculated that leftover technology from Atlantis might be responsible. Maybe they have beam rays down there that just randomly fire off and happen to hit a ship, vaporize it, and just disappears, and then it's gone. So that's one theory that I'll just throw out there. Probably not going to be able to prove that one today, but you never know. Anybody wants to go
Was there a movie,
snorkeling
Atlantis or Waterworld?
Exactly.
Is that what it was called? Waterworld?
Well, no. Waterworld was completely different, but Atlantis was a Disney movie. Quite good.
Atlantis, the Disney movie, and also a hotel, theme park.
I've been there. Yeah.
I have too. I can't remember it.
It's in the Bahamas.
The sea shanties are running low at this point.
Yeah. Anyway,
Okay,
I think Alice is telling me she don't want to talk about this anymore.
No, that's not true. I just want to figure out what happened to the USS Cyclops. Okay, before we move away from the theories, let's talk about some of the most notable Bermuda Triangle mysteries. 1881, the Ellen Austin, our very own USS Cyclops in 1918, 1945, Flight 19, the PBM Mariner, 1967, the Witchcraft, and 1969, the Great Isaac Lighthouse. Brett, let me ask you this. Has there been a famous disappearance in more recent history? Have our better technological capabilities prevented additional terrors of the Bermuda Triangle? And that's why us 80s and 90s children no longer have to face the fears that is a very real fear.
That's a great question. That's a good question. I think it's one that probably says a lot about whatever's happening in the Bermuda Triangle. I don't know. Those are the ones that are often listed. I don't know what the most recent serious disappearance is. You will find disappearances of small planes. That happens quite often. But I'll just go ahead and tell you, small planes are death traps. Small planes and motorcycles are a great way to die young. They're both awesome. I love motorcycles. I would love to ride motorcycles. I just don't want to die right now. Once I'm ready to die, then I'll start riding motorcycles on like a regular occasion. But right now, I want to live for a little bit longer. And I feel like small planes are the same way. They're great. I'm sure the freedom you feel when you can just fly your single engine prop plane from island to island, it's great. But they crash all the time. So the fact that you have these single engine aircraft disappearing in the Bermuda Triangle is probably not as significant. If you had, say, a 747 take off from Miami and disappear on the way to Europe, that would be significant. But I don't think you see that so much, which sadly is probably an argument against the Bermuda Triangle. Okay, so let's talk about the real theories.
Let's talk about Cyclops, because I want to know what's going on with Cyclops.
You know, we don't have aliens on the list, Alice. I'm kind of disappointed in this. I don't know what we were thinking.
That was an oversight on our part.
That was an oversight. Why don't you go ahead and give the alien theory?
All right, let's start there. I mean, I think the most obvious theory here, especially when we're talking about no debris, no sign, a last communication that weather fair, all well, The only thing that could have happened is that something very otherworldly came out of nowhere in a split second, was able to warp up everyone, all 309 men who were very well trained in these seas, and they had just been seen. They were going to be expected in a couple of weeks. And the only way you can explain 11,000 tons of manganese ore, one of the largest ships of, history, and 309 men disappearing into thin air is something otherworldly, and that is aliens. They have the capabilities. They're able to open up in a way that I don't know that the Bermuda Triangle can. I don't really think the Bermuda Triangle can open up Moses style and swallow up this entire ship with no debris, no sign, because remember, the Navy searched for a month. They wanted to find this, not just because of their servicemen, but because this is one of their ships. If it were hijacked by enemy ships, they needed to know this for counter surveillance purposes. They didn't find a single trace. But aliens being able to open up their ship and their vortex into another universe and zap up everything, I think it's an open and shut case, Brett.
I mean, you can't disprove it. And
definitely cannot disprove it.
If you can't
there's
disprove
no evidence
theory,
of it, but there's no evidence against it either.
That's right. And that's really the key. If there's no evidence against it, you don't have to have evidence for it. You just have to believe. So I believe in the aliens. The aliens did it. You guys can laugh for now, but when the aliens unveil themselves, you guys all saw the Super Bowl ad. It's coming. It's coming. And look, they could have gotten 300 people all at once. Why travel around picking up cows and random drunk hunters when you can plop up
go for 309? You got this whole town. You get the manganese ore. We don't know what elements they have in their universe, but I know that manganese ore is going to be pretty valuable wherever you are. So if you get 11,000, maybe they just wanted the manganese ore, but the people had to come with it,
Well, those of you who follow the ancient astronaut theory know that the reason the aliens came in the first place, the Anunnaki, was to create a slave race, humans, to mine precious metals, which they needed for their spacecraft. So maybe this is just a continuation of that. I expect to see a USS Cyclops episode of Ancient Aliens if it hasn't happened already, and I bet you it has. So can't disprove aliens. We're just going to leave it there. Maybe it's aliens. Let's talk about maybe a slightly more likely theory, which we also didn't have on the list, but Justine has brought up, and which I love so much. We're going to talk about it. And that is the Kraken. And I think what we need, if we're going to talk about the Kraken, is a reading from the Kraken by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Below the thunders of the upper deep, far, far beneath in the abysmal sea, his ancient, dreamless, uninvaded sleep, the Kraken sleepeth. And those of you who don't know, the Kraken is a sea monster of lore, which is essentially a gigantic octopus. So great, so vast, that it could rise from below the seas and bring down an entire ship, just like the Cyclops, without leaving anything behind. And, unlike aliens, we actually have proof that there are gigantic octopi and squids deep, deep, deep in the oceans, which we have almost no knowledge of. We almost never see them. Our best evidence of them is if we occasionally will find specimens of sperm whales, which are massive creatures that have scars all over them, which are suspected to be from these titanic battles that happen deep beneath the ocean between the sperm whales and these massive octopi. Octopi, by the way, this is another thing that some people think are aliens. That's completely, that we going way down the rabbit hole there. But nevertheless,
they 100% look like aliens. You're totally right about that. We also have a lot of books about octopi and giant squid, and they look otherworldly. I think this is crazy that for their size, there are entire species of giant squid and octopi that no human eyes have ever laid upon in their entirety. We've seen like a tentacle. We've seen parts of one. I think we've maybe even seen parts of a dead one, but we've never seen a live one. So we know they exist because there's evidence of them, but they live so far deep into the ocean near where the Kraken is that perhaps the Kraken is what it is.
I think it's a possibility. So only slightly more likely than the Kraken is a German U-boat. Let's talk about German U-boats. So back in World War I, as we talked about earlier, one of the strategies of the German Navy in both World Wars was to cripple shipping so that the fighting forces in the European theater were unable to continue. And the way they did this was through U-boats. In fact, U-boat action was one of the reasons that the United States actually entered the war, because at some point the Germans started what they called unrestricted U-boat warfare. So they would sink ships from neutral countries, mostly the United States, that were supporting the war effort. As we said, at this point, World War I is underway when the USS Cyclops vanishes, and that leads many to believe that this was the result of some German attack. There are several theories for how this could have been done. It could have been sabotage. Explosives could have been put in the hold before leaving port. This might have been something that German sympathizers in South America would have done. Or it could have been a German U-boat that torpedoed the ship. But as time goes on, this seems more and more unlikely. And the reasons are pretty obvious. Number one, if the ship was blown up, you would expect to find some fragments, some sort of evidence of the explosion. In fact, the fact that it was blown up would seem to create more debris, more fragments, more oil slicks than if the ocean just opened up and swallowed it, or if it got hit by a rogue wave. Now, it is true that if the boat was torpedoed, there's one thing that would have happened that didn't happen. You would expect an SOS. It happens that ships are torpedoed and they sink very quickly. This was a pretty big ship. You would think if this happened, there would at least be some time to fire off an SOS and attempt to get rescue. That did not happen. The other thing, there were U-boats operating very close to the coast of the United States in both wars. And it's certainly possible that a ship could encounter a U-boat in these waters. But there's one big thing that we don't see. We don't see any records of German U-boats in the area at the time, and we don't see any records of the sinking of the ship. Imagine what kind of prize this would have been for a U-boat. A U-boat to sink one of the largest ships in the U.S. Navy and a major supply ship. This would have been huge for the crew. It would have been huge for the captain. It would have been the kind of thing that as soon as you did it, you would have radioed back to Germany that you did this. Like, even if something happened to you and you didn't make it back to port, you would have let them know. And in fact, U-boat captains in both World War I and World War II took meticulous notes of the ships they sank. And we tend to know every ship that was sank by a U-boat in the wars. Not saying it couldn't happen. You know, maybe they sank the ship and as it was sinking, it hit the U-boat and the U-boat sank too. But there is no record of it, so we don't have that evidence. Could it have been somehow infiltrated or sank? Sure, but I think the fact that we see so little evidence of it means it's unlikely that the Germans attacked the ship.
But it's a good theory because we have a very important supply ship here in the midst of the war. But I think you're right. There's really not a lot of evidence to support it. So let's talk about another popular theory. And it's the tragedy that was brought on by a captain and crew who were ill-equipped to handle the voyage. One Navy officer, Conrad A. Nervig, spent some time on this voyage, but was actually transferred off the ship once it arrived in Rio. And he had the following to say about his time on the Cyclops. Quote, he described the commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley, as a gruff, eccentric salt of the old school, given to carrying a cane, but possessing few other cultural attainments. He was a very indifferent seaman and a poor, overly cautious navigator. Unfriendly and taciturn, he was generally disliked by both his officers and men. Nervig recounts an incident where one of the engines was turned over while a sailor was nearby. The force of the propeller drew in the boat and knocked the sailor overboard, and he drowned. Nervig blamed this tragedy on a captain who created a thoroughly demoralized and disorganized crew because of his irrational methods of command. But, as the U.S. Naval Institute points out, even a bad commanding officer and a crew with low morale can usually transit on a standard voyage through peaceful waters. So something else had to be responsible, at least partially, for the disappearance. There has been further speculation that Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley, who was generally disliked, may have even been pro-Germany, and volunteering turned the USS Cyclops over to the Germans. But like what Brett just said about the German U-boats, there's no records that have ever been found to support the theory that Lieutenant Commander Worley was a German sympathizer and a traitor to have turned over a boat. And you'd have to believe that the 308 other men on board somehow just let him hand over all of them and their ship over to the Germans without someone getting a message out, someone jumping overboard onto some sort of rescue boat, getting away, getting message out. We have a traitor on our hands. Nothing like that happened. But we do know that the commander, he was not a really good captain. But again, without some external force, they'd already made it most of the way back. They were on their last, 1,800 miles. And so even being unliked and not the greatest, they did have one death, not 309 deaths and an entire ship gone missing.
Yeah, they were close to home. Any theory that this is some sort of mutiny or anything like that, I think, is pretty weak. Makes for a great movie, I'm sure, to have that happen. But I think the reality is probably not the case. But this is one of those things where, as a standalone theory, it fails. But as a component of other theories, I think it becomes much more powerful. We'll keep this one in the back pocket as we move forward. So one thing we've talked about was how heavy the boat was. So Nervig, who we've talked about, he provided further explanation as to what could have happened. This is kind of like Dyatlov Pass, where you have the one survivor who didn't go with them, and he's able to give you some insight into the possibilities. And he said it could have been you had this inept captain and you had this heavy load, and they could have resulted in the vessel splitting down the middle and sinking very quickly. Here's how this theory is described by the U.S. Naval Institute. The manganese ore could have been stored only in the holds amidships, therefore accentuating the vessel's inherent weakness. This mid-storage was probably because the only officer on board with experience storing manganese ore was the executive officer, who had been placed under arrest and confined to his room due to what was described as a trivial disagreement with the captain. Not a great way to lead there, El Capitan.
He sounds like a pretty important person that you don't want under arrest on board.
Yeah. Kind of like those of you who are watching the Super Bowl, Travis Kelce at some point lost his mind and was being incredibly inappropriate with his head coach, but it's like it's the Super Bowl, so you can't bench him, and then they end up winning the game. Same thing. Maybe, this first officer shouldn't have done that, but when it comes to loading the manganese ore, maybe just let him do it. So Nervig explained that the stress at sea could break the ship in two, allowing it to quickly fill with water as the ship went vertical on both sides, and he believed this could happen so quickly that no lifeboats could be deployed, no distress signal could be sent out. Now look, this is just a theory. We don't really have any evidence to back it up, but when you think about the evidence that we don't have, no debris, no oil slick, maybe it feels a little bit more likely that this happened so quickly that some of those things didn't develop in the way you would expect, and the fact that you have this lack of an SOS. So that's also a possibility.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
And so I think we're getting closer to maybe what happened here. You know, when you hear that timeline, it's hard to ignore some of the things that were happening. A cracked cylinder when they had stopped in Rio. They had stopped for an unplanned visit in Barbados to resupply. They should have had enough to make it all the way back. So what was the resupply for? And they were taking on additional weight on an already very heavy ship. So what about additional mechanical problems? So since the ship was known to have had an issue with a cracked cylinder on one engine, some suggest that the cylinder broke, causing the vessel to operate with only one engine with this increased heavy load. This would have made the ship more susceptible to other engineering issues, potentially something grave enough to sink the ship. There have been reports of other issues, such as separation of pipes and hull damage that was not appropriately addressed by the captain, our inept captain. So maybe it was a confluence of all of these factors, the heaviness, the mechanical problems, and an inept captain. Interestingly, both of the USS Cyclops sister ships, the USS Nereus and the USS Proteus, fantastic names, also disappeared in the Atlantic Oceans with all hands lost. Okay, I think this is a huge fact. So, sister ships, meaning they are very similar in build. They have the same function. They are also massive. You can tell by their names, also mythical creature names. All disappeared at sea with everyone on board as well. So something has happened to this build of ship. Even more strangely, the USS Nereus was traveling the same route as the USS Cyclops when it disappeared. Proteus and Nereus made it much longer than the Cyclops, though, surviving till 1941. Remember, that's decades after the disappearance of Cyclops in 1918. But neither ship was claimed by U-boat captains, and what happened to them today is still a mystery. So you can't help but wonder if there was some fundamental design flaw in this class of ships when 3 of these sister ships all disappeared with all hands on board without a trace. A flaw that was fatal once triggered and not one you could fix because once it's triggered, everything disappeared.
Of course, that's ridiculous. We know what actually happened. It was the Bermuda Triangle. It was the Kraken. It was some sort of supernatural event that reached up and grabbed the ship and drug it down into the seas with no time to leave an SOS, no debris left behind. You know, maybe it sailed through some sort of time loop, and any day now, the USS Cyclops will sail back into existence and show up in some port 100 years later, and we'll all be shocked and amazed. Or it was a design flaw. I think if I have to give a final theory on this, I'm probably going to have to say that there's a combination of things happening here, none of which probably have anything to do with the supernatural. I think the fact that, as Alice pointed out, the remarkable fact that you had 3 of 4 ships, there are 4 ships in this class, 3 of them disappeared without a trace, without an SOS, with all hands lost, seemingly vanishing into nowhere. Now, another one was in the Bermuda Triangle, so maybe that the Kraken got it too. Or it could be that there was some sort of major design flaw in these ships that made them prone to sink and sink very quickly if something specific happened. And I think what you had here, you had a bad captain, you had the problem with the engine, which meant longer sailing time, which meant more stress on the ship, and you had put too much manganese ore in, and you had misloaded it, and you added more cargo in Baha'i, or wherever it was, And I think those things probably all combine together to create a catastrophic, and somebody pointed out, flammable cargo. So the manganese ore itself is not flammable, but the dust that comes off of manganese ore is, and in fact, it's explosive. So if you don't properly store it, it can cause an explosion. So you have a combination of events and a flaw in the ship's design and a really bad captain. And I think probably this ship, something absolutely catastrophic happened to it and its two sister ships that caused it to sink basically instantaneously and killed everyone on board very quickly. The ship sank. It sank essentially so quickly that there really wasn't any debris. The oil slick would have been in a very isolated space. It might have burned off to some extent too if there was an explosion, which would have created less debris to find. I think that's probably what happened. I think the ship disappeared like that, probably because of some sort of design flaw.
Which I think if you witnessed it would have probably looked supernatural, even with all of that, because of how quickly it happened to the size of the ship. And I think the key is exactly what you said. The fact that 3 of these 4 of the same class ships all disappeared. Something happened that we don't know, because once it happens and, ends the ship, we can never fix it again. But there you go. That's how you fix a 100-year-old mystery. And yeah. I'm not any less scared of the Bermuda Triangle. I'm not going to lie.
Well,
because it's still weird that the USS Nereus and the USS Cyclops were on the exact same route when they both disappeared. So that's still weird.
Just because we came up with a theory to make ourselves sleep better at night doesn't mean that it's not the Bermuda Triangle.
That's right.
And as for me and my family, we will be avoiding the Bermuda Triangle and quicksand for the foreseeable future. For eternity.
But you will go to Dyatlov Pass, so I still question your judgment. But there you have it. It feels good to solve a 100-year-old mystery.
It does. I feel like we solve these mysteries all the time. These 100-year mysteries just fall to our logic.
They just need to come ask us. Nobody's asking us to look at U-boat records.
Really, what they should do is they should give us a Netflix show. That's what we need.
About time. And then you can wear your Kraken hat all the time.
$100 million.
And maybe the show would be called like The Kraken Hat Wearing, Sea Shanty Loving, and the Flu.
Cold Water Prosecutors. And the Flu.
Cold Water Prosecutors, exactly.
And the one who's always sick. Or at least sounds like she's always sick.
I'm really not always sick. This is like the only time. It just never ends. Okay, well, that was highly satisfying, I will say, because when I first started reading about it, all the things online, they always want mystery. And I think there is mystery. Here's the thing. We don't actually know what happened. And unless there's evidence that comes up, which it probably will not after more than 100 years, we won't know definitively what happened. But I think that's probably the best theory based on what we know.
What I'm really interested to know from you guys, I don't care what you thought about the episode, because I don't really care about your opinion, to be honest with you. But what I am interested in is, were there things that when you were young, you thought were going to take up a lot of your time that turned out not to be that important? Another one for me was rabies, and I blame Old Yeller for that.
Oh, yeah. And
black holes. Oh, yeah.
Singularities. Singularities, yeah. Right? There was a book called Singularity.
Black holes were
and I thought
up.
that I would just get sucked into black holes all the time. They would open up like the Ryan the Witch in the Wardrobe. And if I wasn't careful, I'd trip into a black hole and never get out, because singularities, obviously you can't get out of them.
So I wrote a book once that had black holes in it. And I tried to figure out various things about black holes. And it was just completely, I couldn't do it. I mean, honestly, those of you out there who study black holes, you're just so much smarter than anyone else. I do have questions about black holes. I have so many questions about black holes. So if you're an astrophysicist and you listen to this podcast, I want you to email me so I can ask you all my questions about black holes, because it's very important to me. I have many questions. But I also thought, well, you had that Disney movie called The Black Hole, which was another one that,
there's a lot. Rabies is really scary, though, because it is lethal. So that's like a real legit. And we also live,
tetanus, that's another one. Yeah.
Tetanus, I was afraid of stepping on nails. But rabies, I think, is an actual legit fear for people. That's why there are rabies shots. And we live among animals like squirrels and rabbits and foxes and dogs and cats that could all transmit rabies. So I think that's still a legit fear.
So shout out to Mr. Ballin. I was watching one of Mr. Ballin's videos on YouTube, and it was about a guy who got a kidney transplant. And then sometime later started getting sick, and they could not figure out what was wrong with him. And he ends up dying, and they do test on his brain, and they discover that he had rabies. And he had gotten rabies through the transplant. The person the original guy who died, they didn't know why he died. They didn't realize he died of rabies. He dies of rabies. He is a organ donor. It turns out he had been bitten by a raccoon, and that's what killed him. And this guy gets rabies and dies through a transplant. And they had to track down all the other organs. Nobody else had gotten sick yet, so they were able to give them the vaccine. So none of them got rabies.
That is
but this one
terrifying that it goes into your organs because you think it just goes to your brain, but that you can transmit it that way, which I guess makes sense.
All right. So I hope you guys will enjoy that. Let us know what things bothered you. Shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media, including TikTok. I'm ashamed. You guys know TikTok's the devil, but we're on it. So if you're gonna listen to it anyways, you might as well listen to us. And we're on there. And I'll say this: you get like much quicker responses to everything that's going on in the news if you listen to TikTok, because we do like 1 minute. Hey, this crazy thing happened in Delphi today. So you can listen to that, or you can listen to us read bad reviews, which is another thing that we're doing on TikTok these days. So
when I get better, I'm going to read my bad reviews about my nose.
Yeah, it's going to be great. They're hilarious. I mean, they really are. I mean, shout out to all you one-star people.
It's amazing
so
how mean they are.
They're
like unbelievably mean.
So check that out. Thank you to all of you listening on Patreon, live and ad-free, or those of you watching here with us as we recorded this episode. Really appreciate you guys. Okay, Alice, do you feel like doing some questions? I know you've been sick.
Let's do it. Can't wait.
Okay. I'm gonna go. I've been avoiding the hard questions, so I'm just gonna go to the next one. This one, Alice, you have answered before, and I have answered before as well. But for Simone, I'm going to ask it again very quickly. There you go. We'll change our answers. I'm going to make it much, much more interesting. Did you always want to study law? If not, what was the first thing you wanted to be? I wanted to be an exotic dancer, but it didn't work out. I didn't have the body type for it, so I went into law instead.
I wasn't ready for that. No, I did not want to be a lawyer at all. I, too, wanted to be an exotic pianist who accompanied an exotic dancer. But it didn't work out because those were
we still could have been
hours.
A team.
We totally could have been a team.
We could have been a team.
Maybe there's still time.
OnlyFans would have been out of this world, Alice.
It would have been something else, you know, live music to accompany the salacious artistry. Yeah.
Or you could have been an econometrician. There was that option as well.
Never. That was never on the table.
Never on the table.
Just kidding. It was definitely on the table.
Okay. This one, Austin, this one's kind of morbid, my man. I'm gonna ask it anyway, but it's a little morbid. Austin wants to know if you could ask one question to any one deceased victim, who would it be and what would you ask?
Honestly, I wouldn't ask them any questions. I'd just give them a hug.
No.
Honestly, like there's nothing that I want to know from them because it's all going to be horrendous before they died.
Well, that is very noble of you, Alice. So let me give the real answer. I would want to know from Zolotarov from Dyatlov Pass what happened on that side of that mountain that day. And the reason I would ask him is because you may recall, despite what you may read about various Frozen movie inspired theories, Zolotarov was outside of the tent with his camera, the camera that was still around his neck when his body was found, and a notepad and a pencil. The notepad and pencil, which were in his hands when his body was found. So clearly, he knew what happened and wanted to communicate it to the world. So he would be the one that I would ask a question of. I would want to know.
That's a good
from
question.
Zolotarov.
That's a really good question. And I would just give Zolotarov a hug and say, man, that must have really stuck.
All I got to say, Alice, is if only one of us gets the chance to do this and you do, ask the man the question. You can give him the hug. While asking him the question.
For you, I will.
Thank you, Alice. Okay, one more question. Leah, I'm going to read your question and not answer it because we will answer that in a legal briefs because this is a hard question.
Okay.
Leah wants to know, how is it determined whether a defendant can raise an alternate suspect in their case? And there's an entire legal structure for that with a lot of different precedents and everything else. I mean, essentially, just quick and dirty, it has to be someone for which there is actually evidence that they may have done it. You can't just throw out some name. You know, you have to be able to back it up. But we'll do a legal brief on that because that's a great question.
That is a great question, though. Well done.
And it's coming up. I mean, Delphi obviously will have that. So we'll need to talk about that at some point. Okay, let's one more. Okay, I don't have an answer to this, but I bet you Alice does. So this is Brooklyn on Fire. And Brooklyn on Fire wants to know, have you ever been in a life or death situation, and how did you get out of it alive? I actually do have an answer to this, but...
Go, Brett.
Okay. This is, I don't know. This is my life or death situation, which probably wasn't actually a life or death situation, but felt like one at the time. So when I was a senior in high school, a lot of you guys probably had like senior skip day. I don't know if you had that or not, but we had senior skip day, which was like a Friday that basically none of the seniors went to school. We just all went and did something else. And we have a lake near where I lived. It's called Smith Lake. And it's sort of notorious, people drowning in it, and they never find their bodies. And the reason they never find their bodies is because there's still like a lot of trees and stuff down there that they didn't cut down when they filled up the lake, because it's an artificial lake. And so bodies sink, much like Alice's body in the Continental Divide. They sink down to the body, and then when the gases start developing, that which would normally bring a body back up, they get caught in the trees. So there are all these bodies in the trees. And so occasionally there will be droughts. And when there are droughts, you start to see the treetops sticking out of the top of the water. And that's when we find bodies. The bodies will start floating up because they're no longer so far under the water. Anyways, just to tell you, it's a lake where people die. So we decide on our senior skip day, we're going to go out there. We had a friend who had a boat. And there are cliffs that you can jump off of, which are the kind of things you do before you drown. And then they never find your body. So we parked the boat out in the middle of the water. The lake is very deep, so we did not have like an anchor or anything. So the boat is just sitting in the water, and we swim out to this rock, and then we climb up and we jump off. And we do this for a while. We're just jumping off the cliffs, climbing back up, jumping off. Well, as we're doing this, the boat is slowly floating farther and farther away from us. So we do it for a while, and so everybody starts swimming back to the boat, and it's just me and one other guy. We jump off the cliff. We're in the water. He's got flip-flops, and he was not the best swimmer. And so he asked me if I would take his flip-flops for him to the boat so he could swim to the boat. So I was like, sure. Well, the thing is, I'm not the best swimmer either. I'm actually a pretty terrible swimmer. But I was like more in shape or whatever. So I guess the thought was, I'm going to be able to do this. So I had these flip-flops, and I'm thinking to myself, so how am I going to get these flip-flops to the boat? And I decide, well, I'm just going to put them on. So I put on these flip-flops. And so I've got them on my feet, and I'm like holding them on my feet. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to swim to this boat. And I start swimming. And I don't know how far away that boat was, but at the time and looking back on it, it feels like it was like 3 miles away. And I swam. And the thing is, I'm having to use mostly my arms because I don't want to kick too much because I don't want to lose the flip-flops, which float, by the way. This is like, so I'm swimming, and man, it started to get where I didn't know if I was going to be able to make it. And like, I actually started to kind of panic at this point because the boat is so far away and I'm trying to swim. And I'm like, there were points where I wanted to call out for help, but I was so tired and I was using so much energy to swim that I didn't. And I actually learned later on that when people drown, they tend not to call out for help for this very reason. And like, I just remember swimming. And at some point I was like, the only way I'm going to make it is if I'm better swimming underwater than I am above water. So I'm going to swim underwater. I'm just going to come up for breaths every now and then. I'm just going to go as hard as I can, but I'm panicking. But I remember in that moment, like this clarity of, I don't know, like all good Southerners, I'm sure it was God, this voice in my head that was basically like, just keep going. Don't stop. Like whatever you do, don't stop. And so I started swimming under the water, and I finally made it to that boat. And I remember grabbing on to the stairs that led from the boat down in the water and just holding on to the stairs for dear life, not be able to say anything. My friends are freaking out, and I just can't. All I could do was hold on to the stairs and like try and catch my breath because I was so completely out of it. I just couldn't do anything. And eventually they kind of pulled me into the boat, and I just collapsed on the boat. And it was a terrifying experience. And I remember years later, one of my friends who was on that boat was like, yeah, I didn't think you were going to make it. Like, we were like,
real quick question. Why didn't they come closer to you?
That's what I asked. I was like, why did you drive the boat over?
They knew you were struggling. Why did they come for you? Those are bad friends,
They
Brett.
basically started, the way he put it, they were freaking out so much they didn't know what to do. Like they were paralyzed by inaction because they were seeing me clearly struggling and they didn't know what to do. And so they didn't do any of the things they should have done. Like, I don't know, jump in to help me or bring the boat closer. They didn't do any of that. They were just like standing on the boat, willing me to make it. And I guess if I hadn't made it, they would have just watched me drown. But it was a terrifying experience.
Oh, my God.
And I should have just let the flip. But I tell you what, I got those flip-flops back to that boat.
I bet you your friend felt really bad about that.
Probably.
So mine is similar in that it had to do with water. You guys have heard about, getting hit by an 18-wheeler, those sorts of things. Those were terrifying, and those were probably actually life and death experiences. But this one probably was not really, but it felt like it because it felt like I had no choice. So I was scuba diving, and we were scuba diving and we were going spearfishing. When you go spearfishing, you don't have oxygen. So already all day I'd been kind of going without oxygen, doing deep dives. And so my lungs were already tired. And of course, if you've gone scuba diving before, you know that you can't come up too quickly, right? Scuba diving with the oxygen allows you to go deep enough where you're so deep you can't just come straight back up, or you basically have an aneurysm because the pressure in your head builds so fast. And so that's kind of ingrained in you when you're in the water. Even if you have to come up for air, let's say your oxygen tank runs out of oxygen, you can't just shoot up to go get air because your brain will explode and you'll die anyway. So you have to kind of fight against yourself when you're running out of oxygen to go up at certain degrees to save your brain, but still have enough oxygen to make it up to the top. So I had made it to the bottom. Not bottom. We were like kind of exploring at the bottom. And when you scuba dive, you're with other people, but there's usually just a flag where the boat is and everyone does their own exploration. And I'm not like a really good scuba diver or anything. And I hate the water, really. I don't like open water. It's really terrifying. And we've been scuba diving all day, and there are sharks and there are barracuda. There's all sorts of wildlife that I don't like anyway. So I'm already pretty scared down there. But all of a sudden I look down at my oxygen and it is on empty, but it shouldn't have been because it had been full when I got into the water. So something had happened. I found out later that there was a leak. Great time to find out about this. And I looked down, I was like, okay, well, usually it shouldn't be empty. Maybe the gauge is wrong because I know it was full when I went into the water not that long ago. And I know how fast this is supposed to be kind of going down. And in these situations, you can motion to somebody else and you can share oxygen. But everyone had kind of dispersed, and there was a lot of kind of sand at the bottom because there was a lot of like stingrays at the bottom, manta rays, and they had kind of disturbed the sand at the bottom. So you couldn't really see people clearly. So no one was kind of responding to my, I need help. But I knew I was too far deep down to be able to shoot up and just go get air. It was too far down that I knew I was going to do major damage to my brain if I did that. And so this is like my worst nightmare. I haven't gone scuba diving since then, by the way. This is the last time I've gone scuba diving. And I was trying so hard not to panic, because when you panic, you use up more oxygen. And you don't know that you're out of oxygen when you're breathing it, by the way, because when it says empty, you're still breathing stuff in. It just starts to be carbon dioxide and not oxygen. And so it's not like it all of a sudden suffocates and you can't breathe in, but what you're breathing in isn't oxygenating you. But I don't know how much oxygen I'm getting, but in my mind, I am dying. And so I start making my way up slowly. But at this rate, I don't think I'm going to make it up to the top without passing out. Or I could go up and cause my brain to explode. And obviously, long story short, I am here today. Everything is fine. I did not run out of oxygen and my brain did not explode. But in that moment, I remember thinking it's a no-win situation. There's a literally no-win situation. If I pass out, my body's going to float up probably too fast and my brain's going to explode anyway. So I'll die from suffocation and a brain aneurysm at the same time. And so that was the last time that I went scuba diving.
Yeah, I don't like to swim in lakes to this day because of that.
Yeah,
but
I don't like swimming anymore. It's just not, it's not great. So
I'm glad you made it.
I'm glad I made it too. That was not fun.
Wasn't there one time that you got mugged and you slapped the gun away or something?
Yeah. That was probably another life and death situation.
And
that
there
was
was a
living
time
in
you
New
got
Haven.
hit by the 18-wheeler.
Yeah, we talked about that at the.
Yeah.
But people have heard those stories before.
That's true.
The guy who tried to mug me. I mean,
He's
this
scarred
doesn't
by it
always
to
work.
this day.
No, this doesn't always work. And, they say to like bow up to a shark or whatever, bear when they come at you. Like, I was just pissed. I was like, no, you are not mugging me today, mother effer. Like, come at me, bro. And he backed down. He like did not want to mess with me that night. I guess I looked pretty scary, which
Scarred
says something.
to this day.
Scarred to this day.
That poor mugger. Probably still in therapy about it.
He didn't get anything from me.
Yeah, well, good. Well, this has been fun, as always. Love the stories. If you want to leave a 5-star review, we will answer your questions eventually. It's funny. We've started tricking the people who hate us into leaving 5-star reviews because they leave 5-star reviews and they leave like some snarky question. And it's like, this is hilarious. You guys are so
pretty funny.
Clever. But anyway, so we'll get to their questions eventually.
Yeah. Maybe the guy who tried to mug me is going to leave a 5-star
There you
review
go.
and be like, I have a name. My name's Brandon.
Yeah. Quit calling me the mugger. Anyway.
He's the mugger.
All right. Well, next week, we're going to start one of the most intriguing, mysterious, dare I say controversial stories. I'm already trying to figure out whether Alice is going to be sued for defamation because of this one.
Definitely going to get sued for defamation.
That's kicking it around, whether or not she will be or not. But
I don't know.
we'll see.
That's why I asked you if I was going to get sued for defamation.
And I was
on
like,
my theory.
as I said, great press, right? We get sued by
Great
for
press,
defamation. We get
but
great press.
we should probably get that insurance that we've been talking about.
We probably should. But it's going to be fascinating. So I hope you guys will all join us for that one. A little bit more serious than this one. And a tragic case in a lot of ways, but just a absolute whodunit. So looking forward to that one. Hope you guys have enjoyed tonight, and I hope you guys will enjoy that one. And we will start that one next week. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. I always felt like rabies was the best precursor to a zombie outbreak. Those of you who've seen Wreck, that's what causes the zombie outbreak in that. So that's really good. Because you have two forms of rabies. One which essentially puts you in a coma, but the other one which is like aggressive, where you actually try and bite other people. Like it causes you to try and transmit the rabies. So, you know.
By the way, we do have ads today. Before we do that, I wanted to just go blow my nose, and then I'll come
Go blow
back.
your nose. We got to answer a question anyway. Go blow your nose.
Okay,
Go blow your
I'll
nose.
be right back.
Okay. See, this is what you guys are paying the extra money for. Is this Alice blowing her nose? Congratulations to all of you. You made a good investment.
Pluto TV is TV the way it should be, free. With over 300 channels, thousands of movies and TV shows costing zeros of dollars. So if you want to watch shows like Ghost, The Walking Dead, CSI, Star Trek, or The Price is Right, well, The Price is Right. It's free. Hit movies like Braveheart, Sonic the Hedgehog, Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy, or Mean Girls won't cost you a thing, because everything is free. All you have to do is download the app, which, by the way, is also free. Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.
Are you looking for a new job or want a career change? Look no further than Monster.com. Need a little help standing out? Our expert resume writing services will make sure you shine. Want to brush up on your interview skills? Engage with our AI interview prep tool. Want some advice on negotiating your new salary? Visit our salary tools and extensive library of career advice articles, and you'll have all the tips and tricks you'll need to succeed. Visit Monster.com today and take the first step towards your career. Monster.com. Find your right job fit.